Hello everyone, welcome to our BERA Race, Ethnicity and Education Special Interest Group meeting. I'm Marlon Moncrief from the University of Brighton, and I'm joined with our co-conveners of the SIG, Nigel Riaz from the University of West of Scotland, and Pere Eiling from the University of Suffolk. We hope you're well and managing to look after yourselves, your friends and families in this difficult lockdown. And we're just so glad that you've been able to join us today, this afternoon. Just want to sort of talk about what we want to cover today. We want to be able to give you an overview of what the SIG's been able to produce over the last year. And then we want to talk about some future possibilities that we can develop with you to ensure that we can keep our profile raised high during this next academic year. So I'm going to start off with talking about what we've done over the last academic year, and then I'm going to hand over to Nigel and Pere to lead on talking about the future possibilities for this year. So we hope to have this meeting at the BERA conference in September, but that was obviously cancelled due to COVID. And then we aim to book this meeting for December, but the bookings were filled. So here we are now. And today, I just want to give you a brief review of what our SIG's been producing to champion our work on race, ethnicity and education over the last year. And we want to think about the possibilities of developing those ideas further this year. So at the beginning of last year in February, I think it was February, we produced the well-received Research Intelligence 142. It was decolonizing the curriculum, transnational perspectives, and we had contributors from our SIG, from the UK, from Thailand, from the Russian Federation, from Nigeria, from Canada, and from Kenya. And so we were able to lead the academic discussion on education, teaching and learning, which many have followed in publications on this theme, especially since the Black Lives Matter anti-racism protests that occurred in the summer. Unfortunately for us, we did plan to follow up our publication of Research Intelligence issue 142 with a conference at the University of West of Scotland, but that was cancelled because of COVID. So here we are now, a year later. But just to say that particular publication, issue 142 of Research Intelligence, did go down well, and we hope that our SIG will be able to produce more of these publications with a different range of authors as well, perhaps for 2022 now. So because of the anti-racist Black Lives Matter protests that occurred in the summer, we obviously took note of that, and we were able to work with BERA to produce a call for a blog series that was led by Nigel Riaz, and we were able to attract 8 contributors to that blog series, which is now live on the BERA blog website. And it wasn't just about talking about anti-racism in terms of the BLM issues, but also a more diverse range of issues in education to do with race and ethnicity, including developing a more diverse workforce, including enabling more authority to be given to Black and Asian academics in decision-making processes at the university. So we've done quite a lot this year. We've raised our profile, and we want to do more for the next year. I want to be able to sort of hand over to Pere and Nigel now, so we can talk about some of the ideas that we have in mind for the SIG in order to raise our profile. So over to Nigel and Pere to share some of the ideas that we have in mind.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Dr. Nigel Riaz, and we had a pre-discussion on what would be useful. I think from my perspective, I would really like to do another blog series looking at the impact on COVID on the education sector, but particularly on BAME educators and BAME students. So that is one aspect that I would like to develop further following this SIG. And also that there is that concept of doing podcasts and video logs that I think is a very innovative way forward to capture your thoughts on your experiences since last June, since the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. So Perry, what are your thoughts on some of these ideas, or if you'd like to expand on what your thoughts are?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Pere Aileen, and I'm a lecturer at University of Suffolk, Ipswich, at a small kind of neat university hidden somewhere in the east of England. Yes, in terms of ideas, the possibilities for this year. At the moment in my university, I'm part of a team that we're setting up, planning a conference called a race conference, looking at racism and anti-racism. And like everything, this one came as a result of the Black Lives Matters kind of marches last year and the death of George Floyd in America. So that was the kind of the instigator that started us having this conversation in my university. And now we are definitely going to plan it. The planning is on the way, and it should be September, October time this year. It may be on virtual like this, or it might be a blended one. We're hoping, COVID permitting, it to be a face-to-face conference. And personally, as a member of BIRA and as a convener of this SIG, I'm planning to have our SIG presence at this conference. So we will have a very good kind of huge presence. And I've discussed it with the other members, committee members, and they are happy for our SIG to have a good presence there. It's going to be a multi kind of disciplinary conference. So because we want to encourage people from any walks of life, whether you're a class teacher, so it's not going to be too heavily academic and theoretical. So when we're just finalizing the call for paper, and I'm going to be advertising it via our BIRA and our SIG, so that I'm hoping, please look out for it. Be bold, to put in a paper. We're doing so many, it's not going to just be paper presentations. We're hoping to have posters, we are hoping to have poems, we are hoping to have drama. Just want to be so multidisciplinary so that people can engage with the race conversation without feeling that I have to be an academic, I have to be theoretical in the way I talk. So that is a possibility, that is something in the pipeline. So just watch this space. So that's what I wanted to add.
Brilliant. So in summary, there's the conference that you're going to be leading at the University of West Sussex, in which we can raise a profile of our members' work to a wider academic community. The use of social media that Niget's speaking about in terms of blogs and vlogs, and also the possibility of working with BIRA Publications for a future issue of Research Intelligence. I think what we should do now is open up this up to our members by the chat. Maybe they can ask some questions or give some comments, and we can share those comments with people who've come to this meeting. What would you like us to do, or what could we do to continue to raise the profile of our SIG? How can we extend upon the work that we've done? How can we extend upon some of the ideas that we've just spoken about now? So if you'd like to post some of your questions or some of your ideas in the chat, we can use those to develop this discussion further. Okay.
While those questions are coming in, I just wanted to quickly sort of like share that I'm part of an organisation called Advance HE, which is working with the Scottish Funding Council to lead a project called Tackling Racism on Campus. And we are currently in the process of, well, we've developed assets and we're rolling them out, but it's very much about how This is intersectional across the education sector, and I think we need a joined up approach is very much needed. Another aspect that I think personally has affected me, it's how do we make time for writing? We're juggling so many different aspects from working from home. We have family responsibilities, childcare, homeschooling. It impacts a lot more on women of color who are academics to produce outputs, and it's something that perhaps we should discuss at a later date. So just two of my points that I just wanted to add in there.
Okay, that's a good one. There are some questions coming through. Should I read them out?
Yes, please. Yeah.
There's a couple from Mark Langdon. Sorry if I mispronounced your surname, Mark. Sorry. Mark says, why have we made such little progress in addressing racism and decolonizing the curriculum up until this point? What do we need to change? So that's the first question. Do we want to answer that before I read another one? So I'll read it again. Mark is asking, why have we made such little progress in addressing racism and decolonizing the curriculum up till this point? What do we need to change? So Marlon, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can give a brief response to that. You know, the teaching and learning of race equality, of a more diverse curriculum has been debated in Parliament. I mean, you know, since Black Lives Matter protests this last year in June and July, there were some petitions raised by members of the public, and they exceeded over 100,000. And academics, experts have been talking with government ministers to speak to future developments of the curriculum across all phases. So there are discussions. It's probably going to be a slow process if anything does change. There are plenty of groups out there now who are advocating for this move as well. Universities, more so than last year, from what I've seen by looking for events online, there are quite a few more universities that are bringing groups together to discuss ways in which they can aim to decolonize the curriculum. I think there's still some confusion about what is the difference between decolonizing the curriculum and diversifying the curriculum. So that sort of education and different needs to be shared more widely, so people can know the differences between them. That they both work with each other. So I think people are still learning about the language. I think people know why it needs to occur, but it's about looking to where the best practice and the best progress of this is working. And so once that evidence and that research comes out a bit more, and the profile of the evidence and research is raised, and hopefully other people can follow a bit more. But this needs to be kept on the agenda. You know, Black Lives Matter protests were just last year, but it's what happens next afterwards, and it's down to activists and academics and people who really want to see change to keep these issues on the agenda.
Could I add to that? In Scotland, there's been a lot of activity from grassroots community groups coming together, educator groups like the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators, which are liaising with the Scottish Government in how to frame that conversation, and universities such as Edinburgh, who are very active in leading that anti-racist movement towards decolonising the curriculum. Khadija, as you'll meet shortly, she sits on a new group where she is the chair of developing an anti-racist curriculum, which will be cascaded down through the education sector. And for us, what we've found in the work that we're involved in, it's leadership. We need the political will and the finances from our leadership within our institutions to be able to support and keep this at the forefront of all the work we do around decolonisation and creating an anti-racist pedagogy.
And just to add to that, I think for us as members of this BERA SIG, as the academics that aim to champion this cause, it's about us being able to produce and to share evidence-based practice of the progress that we're making, and really aiming to amplify that work so that it doesn't get lost. So it's not just an event that occurred last year that's forgotten about, and some people do want to forget about it as far as we're concerned, but we can't let them, because it's so important to the lives of people in this country.
Can I just add to that quickly to say what needs to change perhaps is also, I think Khadija and Marlon just mentioned, Niget, and Marlon just mentioned the point about having those at our leadership team committed and willing to fund and listen. I just want to echo that is definitely the case, because I belong also to what we call in my university anti-racist collective is a name. I belong to a group called Anti-Racist Collective, and we are trying to get the leadership, the people at the top to listen and take it seriously rather than pay lip service to the whole idea. But I think just to one point I want to make with regards to Mark's point about specifically what needs to change. I think what needs to change is that we have to bring, it has to be like a triad approach. So academics, the curriculum, and students at the same time, rather than working in different, like separately. You have to work at the same time, because academics are, the universities that I work in, mostly white, and not everybody believes that the curriculum needs to change. That even though they won't say it over, outward, you can tell that they don't believe that there is a need to change the curriculum. There is a need, there is endemic racism. So we need to maybe train our white allies so that they can understand what decolonization is and what the impact of it on students. Okay, moving on to the next question. Richard Race. Hello, Richard. He says, hello colleagues, can we have a SIG event focusing on the book behind Marlon within the SIG? So the book behind you, Marlon, is Decolonizing the History Curriculum, Eurocentrism and Primary Schooling. So Richard is asking, can we have a SIG event that focuses on that book primarily? And one other question, so you can answer both together because they are both relating to that book. Mark again asks, can we, sorry, there's a lot of questions coming in. Sorry, guys, I'm just trying to make sure that no, we'll answer that. You go and answer that, Marlon, if you wish. I'll look for the other question. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share some insights into this work as well, but also not just to sort of have the space for myself, but if there are any other members of the SIG that have written specifically to the theories of decolonial practices in education, perhaps it could be a joint presentation that looks at cross features that may cross over. So I'm happy to look into that with BERA to see whether that could happen in the future. And it kind of relates a little to what Niget was saying about writing as well, because I know that our SIG, we have offered writing workshops in the past. And yeah, that might be an opportunity for us to sort of establish something in the future where we have a live webinar or a live talk, a live discussion with a mentor, somebody who's done a lot of writing around our themes to sort of guide some of the more younger members of the SIG, or even some of the experienced members, if they want to, through the processes of writing, in order to achieve more publications. So that's something that we can maybe discuss, Niget. What do you think about that one, about a writing workshop online?
I would actually welcome them, because life just keeps getting in the way and writing just isn't as prioritized. So we need to, encourage not just ourselves, but members of our SIG to be more active and support them in getting those publications, sharing good practice, sharing publishers, and the kind of navigating those spaces, from putting down ideas to abstracts to papers and then chapters and books.
Okay.
It's not a linear journey, but it's, you know, it's
Yeah.
about knowing your own strengths and weaknesses and addressing them.
Okay, so what we've got out of that brief discussion is a possibility of a future online writing workshop that we can maybe work with Vera to organise for our SIG in the future, and also the possibility of some kind of symposia in relation to publications like the one behind me, or even some publications that members of our SIG are in the middle of producing now that might be ready for the future, that we can have a nice discussion around in order to move ideas forwards. So thanks for that question.
Another question from Diane Warner. A series of BAME and COVID might be a good option, but could we tie it in with something around May, June time? That is about the anniversary of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters riot. So asking whether we can have an event that coincides with that.
Yeah, we can definitely look at the calendar to see. I think as we're saying ourselves, it's about not letting the momentum of the work that we've done and you know, the voices that are in support of transforming for change to be stamped on or suffocated. You know, time does move on, but if we could aim to do something around sort of May or June time that brings back to the fore what happened last year, and if we can champion some of our work through that, then that would be most welcome. So yeah, that's more about looking at the diary to see whether we're available to sort of slot something in, and whether there will be a slot for us via the BERA route as well. So yeah, we'll definitely aim to look into that.
We've got 5 minutes, so just 5 minutes before we move on to the actual event. So, but another question, if I can quickly read this one from Peter Hink, says, is there interest in the SIG in exploring intersectionalities in the racialization of disability? There is a complex pattern of exclusions and disproportionalities in the identification of categories of SEND, social, emotional, and mental health needs of peoples of African Caribbean heritage. Did you get that, Marlon and Niget? That's from Peter Hink.
Yeah.
I think that could be our next blog series. It's very relevant, the impact on many people through the first lockdown, and more so through the second lockdown that we're experiencing, has been huge. And we will be dealing with the repercussions of this for a long time to come. So yes, I very much support the idea of exploring intersectionality, not just across gender, but disability, poverty, and mental health and well-being.
Yeah, I'm with you, Niget, and we have spoken with other SIGs and other SIG leaders not so long ago in the past about aiming to fuse some of our ideas together to present more sort of a blend of our works. And yeah, I mean, I think that's something we can definitely aim to sort of develop in discussion with those SIG leaders again for the future. So I'm happy to sort of take that forward as well with you.
Okay, thank you. I think we still have a couple of minutes. There's one more. Yeah. I'm reading the question with the most likes, guys. So sorry if I don't read your question, just so that we get the ones that are the most likes. Richard Race again saying, another virtual seminar suggestion, Stephen Lawrence Day in April / Black Lives Matter. So again, I think it's similar to some extent with Diane's question. So another virtual is asking, maybe we could have another virtual seminar on Stephen Lawrence Day in April / Black Lives Matter, yeah. Black History Month in October. So he's asking, would colleagues be interested in that? So
yeah. I mean, I think there's quite a few anniversaries in relation to BAME experiences in the UK coming this year. We've just had the New Cross fires anniversary. We've got Brixton 1981 coming up in April as well. It's 40 years since that major uprising in the 1980s. Stephen Lawrence, of course. So, there is opportunity to look to the past to understand the now, to develop some ideas for future possibilities. And even with what was said earlier about maybe looking at doing something in May and June in relation to what happened last year with George Floyd. So I think there's appetite. I think there's a mood to have something for our SIG maybe in the spring or maybe at the beginning of the summer. So I think the onus is on us as SIG leaders to make that happen.
Yes. What do you think? Do I have a time for one more question? Marlon, do you think? So a question from Brianna.
I can just do this. Yeah. Last question before we go.
All right. From Rihanna, she's asking so can we look at something looking at what is happening about supporting students with Black Africa and Caribbean heritages and mental health condition? So she's suggesting maybe as a SIG, maybe one of the things we can look into, maybe when we have one of the events, is looking at the mental health of Black African and Black Caribbean students.
Absolutely, that's fine. And if Rihanna wants to sort of take a lead in that as well, I mean, yeah, absolutely do sort of get in touch with us. And if you've got some writings, if you've done some research on that yourself, then hopefully we can help you to champion that through our channels as well, whether that's a blog, whether that's part of Research Intelligence, whether that's part of a future seminar, completely.
Yeah.
So I think we're gonna end the SIG meeting now, and just thank everybody for their really, really fantastic questions that they've shared with us, and we've got lots of ideas to take forwards for this next year. So that's what I've got to say there. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we've moved to the second part of our SIG webinar. We are going to share some of the very important work on both race equality with a focus on decolonising the curriculum, which is being carried out across England and Scotland in our webinar today. I've been privileged to see emerging good practice and further in higher educational institutions, as well as in our primary and secondary schools, and the critical conversations of our colonial past and Scotland's role in the slave trade and the move towards a more global curriculum, and the time that we need to understand not only the past and the roles that we can play today. As I am prone to say, I need personally to know the missing pieces of my history to understand myself. And on that note, I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Marlon Moncrief, a little bit about him. He's going to be sharing some of his lived experiences and academic knowledge centering on curriculum teaching and learning through some of the Black British histories from the 20th century to now, and with decolonising curriculum knowledge. He is a leading expert on the research on the history of Black British cycling champions. He has groundbreaking research work entitled Made in Britain, uncovering the life histories of Black British champions in cycling, and has won international acclaim. This work has been exhibited in various famous venues across the UK and in multiple publications, broadcasts on BBC, BBC TV, BBC Radio, Sky TV, Eurosport, Tour de France, and on Australian and USA radio. Marlon has been called to share on his leadership, expertise and evidence-based research working on decolonising curriculum knowledge and teaching and learning through Black British histories with many leading national and international authorities, including in the House of Commons, at the UK Parliament, the Chartered College of Teaching, the National Education Union, the British Educational Research Association and British Cycling. Marlon is going to present an overview of his research concerning the decolonising of the primary school history curriculum. He will discuss decolonial theory, historical consciousness, and transformative critical multicultural education as the force of knowledge need to support teachers' approaches and diversification of the history curriculum. We will also be joined by Khadija Mohammed. Khadija is a senior lecturer and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the School of Education and Social Sciences at the University of Western Scotland. Her PhD centres on race equality by exploring the lived experience of Black and minority ethnic teachers in Scotland, with a focus on celebrating their cultural, linguistic and religious identities. Khadija is a co-founder and chair of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators. This is a community-led organisation providing support to educators and those in support and guidance roles across the Scottish education system, from nurseries, schools, colleges and universities. Khadija received the Scottish Trade Union Congress Equality Award in 2019, and she is also the first BAME Muslim educator to be elected as a vice convener of the General Teaching Council for Scotland. That is a very brief summary, but I'd like to add that Khadija is also leading work and sits on committees with the Scottish Government, with the Scottish Funding Council, and is the chair of three high profile groups which are leading the work on race equality and developing an anti-racist curriculum. Welcome, Marlon. We'll start with you.
Thank you, Niket. Okay, let me welcome to my presentation, and let me take you through what I'm going to be talking about today. Decolonising the primary school history curriculum. I'm a former primary school teacher. I taught in the primary school for about 15 years, and now I train students to become primary school teachers at the University of Brighton. And I carry out education research specifically with an examination of 20th century Black British histories. And so this presentation is called Decolonising the Primary School History Curriculum, transforming teaching and learning about national identity and nation. I'm really interested in this notion of national identity and nation, and whether, or the debates of those particular concepts being either fixed or fluid. And so yeah, that's what my research examines in that respect. So next slide, let's go to the discussion points that I want us to consider as part of this presentation. Quite a few of them, but I'm going to aim to cover them all. The Black Lives Matters in education issues from last year, calls for teaching and learning of Black British histories that emerged from that, and then the government denial that followed. And then what we mean by decolonising curriculum knowledge, some of the debates and some of the definitions of that. And then I bring my own take on it through this theory of historical consciousness, and how the different people are orientated with using the past in the present for future understandings of our notions of nation and national identity. And I'm going to explain to you how the national curriculum is positioned with a particular orientation of historical consciousness. And then I'm going to argue that diversification of the curriculum follows a fuller understanding of decolonising the curriculum. That they work hand in hand, but decolonising comes first. And I'll give you some examples of research that I've done with training teachers in using historical consciousness and in using narratives from 20th century Black British history to advance their own ways of teaching and learning the primary school history curriculum in England. And I'm going to show you how the Black British voice was centred in all of that, and argue that we need to encourage greater curriculum thinking. Curriculum is not just the document. It's not just the document given by the government, but curriculum involves that document, the teachers, the students in the class, to frame knowledge that advances the life of opportunities for all in that respect. Next slide. So what happened last year is not new, because since the 19th century, there's always been Black Lives Matter protests. There's been slave rebellions in the Caribbean that relate to the 400 years of displacement of Black people in their diaspora from the African continent That was in the 19th century. In the 20th century, we had inner city uprisings across Britain. I mentioned earlier today that in April it's going to be the 40th anniversary of Brixton 1981. There were many more inner city events like that. That was Black Lives Matters then. And just last year, we had the Black Lives Matters anti-racism marches across the country, across the world. Nothing much has changed for Black people in their 400 years of displacement in the racist system, the white racist system that they find themselves displaced in. Generation after generation are fighting the same fight. So following the Black Lives Matters anti-racism protests of 2020, the teaching and learning of British history came under scrutiny. Calls for changes to the national curriculum became louder through the public petitions presented and debated in Parliament. I was part of that discussion as well with Claire Alexander. And what the arguments were is from the public was that there was an explicit need for teaching and learning about Britain's cultural diversity, and particularly through Black British history. That was the argument made by hundreds and thousands of people across the country. Next slide. But there was a government denial, and the calls for changes they've been rebuffed by a government response insisting that the curriculum is broad, balanced, and flexible enough to offer teaching and learning British history through Black British lives and experiences. And there's possibly some justification in the government response, particularly where the history curriculum aims to ensure that all pupils know and understand the history of the islands as a coherent chronological narrative from the earliest times to the present day, how people's lives have shaped this nation and how Britain has influenced and been influenced by the wider world. So yeah, there's possibly some justification in this notion of, oh, the curriculum is broad and balanced enough. Next slide. But what the recent government response did not acknowledge was the dominance of Eurocentric, whites-only historical starting points throughout the statutory content directives and guidance of the National History Curriculum. These statutory directives and guidance instruct teachers to ensure that all pupils know and understand about how people's lives have been shaped, have shaped this nation, using Britain's settlement by the Anglo-Saxons and Scots and the Vikings and Anglo-Saxon struggle as starting points, statutory directives and guidance. So that is the issue with the national curriculum in terms of those particular elements, the Eurocentric and the whites only. You don't see anything to do with Black or Asian people or non-white people in the curriculum as starting points to understand about how nation building has occurred on these islands. Next slide. So let's examine the issue a little bit more. I'm a Black British man. I was born in London and I've lived in England for my life. My parents are from Jamaica and my grandparents are part of the Windrush generation, if you want. I'm a former primary school teacher and I'm now a teacher educator and researcher, and I'm interested in how 20th century Black British histories can be used in transforming opportunities for curriculum teaching and learning in the primary school. I see that this must begin with decolonizing that Eurocentrism that I've identified explicitly in the current curriculum content. That is the starting point for teachers, for new teachers, for teachers in the primary school, in the secondary school as well. So to decolonize the curriculum is to identify the potential of epistemic violence that can be inflicted, yes, form of violence that can be inflicted on the learner in receipt of that statutory imposed knowledge, in this case, Eurocentric only histories. And there's much research evidence out there. There's a plethora of research evidence out there, evidence-based research, which speaks of this oppression occurring to young minority ethnic group learners, non-white learners in their engagement with the dominant Eurocentric history curricula. Black and Asian children don't want to study history anymore in the future because they don't see themselves represented in the history. So, this current curriculum does inflict epistemic violence through the contents that it chooses to impose upon young learners. Therefore, it needs to be decolonized. There's a bias that needs to be decolonized in that respect. Next slide. So you've seen a book behind me. The book came out in December, and my research, Decolonising the Curriculum, Eurocentrism and Primary School, offers a detailed examination of why and how the white-only curriculum direction and guidance continues to dominate the statutory content directives and guidance of the primary school history curriculum. In short, this is to support the cultural reproduction and communication of an Anglocentric national narrative as the source of national identity and for a fixed idea of nation. Okay, so what we learned in the national curriculum yesterday was the same. We were still learning about Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. We're still learning about it today, and for a particular group in society, that is the way it's going to be in the future. That traditional sense of historical consciousness, in order to maintain a fixed idea of nation and nation building through a particular group of people. My position is that national identity isn't something that can be manufactured or imposed upon a people by a government, by the history curriculum, because we as the people of the British Isles are the history makers, not the government, it's the people. History is made by the people of the British Isles, and history is fluid in that respect, although people argue that it's fixed, but it's fluid. We are the people that change over time, and we are the history makers through notions of ethnogenesis, if you want. Okay, so that's my position in that respect. Next slide. So one of the key arguments concerning the function of teaching and learning of history in schools is its purpose. I was alluding to that a little bit before, but some commentators argue that the teaching of history, of British history in schools, should be fixed and given facts of a British story as a master narrative to maintain a traditional orientation with historical consciousness. If you look at the table here, that's the one in the top left-hand corner, that notion of a notion of historical consciousness. Okay, so specific episodes from history on the British Isles in the past, such as mentioned by the statutory content directives and guidance, are to be taught and learnt as exemplary facts on the origins of national identity in the now and for the future. So that traditional orientation with historical consciousness is maintained. So if we learn about mutual respect and tolerance, or about democracy, we only learn about those through the cross-cultural encounters between the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. And there are some good, some useful stories to know about democracy, to know about mutual respect and tolerance through those groups of people. And we can use those as exemplary types of history. But as I said earlier, the people of the British Isles are the history makers, and times change and new people come, and they create their own stories about mutual respect and tolerance and democracy that can be just as valid, even more credible than the ones of the past. That is the beauty of history. It's fluid in that respect. It doesn't dismiss past forms of history, but it builds upon them through different experiences. That's the argument that I'm making through my book. Okay. So, I mean, it's, the opponents of the fixed mindset, if you want, see history as fluid, constantly moving like a river. The past is referenced, but times and people have changed. The essence of history through this process maps transformations. Seeing the past in the present for perceiving the future and its new possibilities. And this way of seeing that I've spoken about, with new experiences and new voices, building upon the old voices, fits with the critical orientation of historical consciousness. It means that any given exemplary moments of the past, including the idea of our British national identity through Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Scots and nation, and so on, they can be challenged for their relevance and meaning and value in the present. Next slide. So decolonising the curriculum through critical orientations with historical consciousness offers enlightenment for realising that one-dimensional Eurocentric knowledge has been privileged by the statutory content directives and guidance of the national curriculum. Seeing and accepting this can transform thinking about the possibility of broader forms of knowledge for teaching and learning. Encompassing Black British lives, non-white British lives, minority ethnic group lives, in Britain. Encompassing those lives in teaching and learning is the starting point for providing teachers and learners with a curriculum that is more representative of the full range of past experiences. After engaging in this enlightenment process of decolonizing, emerges the creative possibilities for diversification of the curriculum. What I'm saying is that, what I've just said there is that decolonizing, realizing why you're doing it, allows for the possibilities of diversification. It's, some people might call it a chicken and egg thing, but it's not really. From my respect, you have to know why you're diversifying the curriculum. You're doing it because there's a bias, because you've seen a bias, and that bias in this respect is one of Eurocentrism. Next slide, please. So Aronsky's article, "History Belongs to All of Us," is among many in Primary History, the magazine, issue 65, which I looked at, which provides expert coverage on the opportunities for curriculum diversification. And I was interested in working with the planning criteria offered by the article for conceptualizing teaching and learning opportunities through diverse and intertwined stories of and intertwined histories of all peoples of Britain, past and present. And my research shares how inclusive teaching and learning about British history in schools can be arrived at through transformative, critical, multicultural education. Next slide. So I worked with 21 white British primary school teachers. I asked them many questions, but the main question that those came from was, what does British history mean to you? And my diagnostic assessments uncovered the stark impact of their education, their socialisation, and the families as having a heavy influence in framing their thinking about British history as their own starting points, their own biased starting points for teaching about British history in a primary school. So their responses of these 21 white British teachers were generally a regurgitation of the past and present history national curriculum episodes. So for them, British history meant teaching about the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Tudors, the Victorians, World War II. Okay, so it shows how their conditioning has framed their starting points. And the reason why I work with white British trainee teachers is because around 85% of the teaching population in England and Wales are white British teachers. So this particular study was reflective of the teaching workforce in some respects. Next slide. So next, I provided these teachers with a range of oral testimonies that were written firsthand by African Caribbean people, Black British people, concerning their lived experiences from episodes of British history, including migration to the British Isles from Jamaica as part of the Windrush generation, and cross-cultural encounters, a bit like the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, but cross-cultural encounters more recently through the Brixton uprisings of 1981. And the aim of my research was to centre the Black British voice, allowing these to lead the telling of British history. Okay, because some people say what happened in Brixton was a riot, but some people say it was an uprising. Some people say they were disorders. Some people say they were disturbances. Depends who you are. And that is the beauty of history. There are different viewpoints that need to be understood, not just the dominant discourse of it being a riot. Some people say, it was an uprising for some people. Another aim of the research was to see if these oral testimonies could support the trainees transforming their embedded thoughts of Eurocentrism about British history in their work with children for the future. Next slide. And here are some responses from some of those trainee teachers as part of the focus group that followed when they looked at those oral testimonies. These are pseudonyms, by the way. Okay, so they took those oral testimonies and they compared them with the aims and contents of some aims and contents of the national curriculum, and they're able to contrast and propose new ideas for their teaching and learning. So all of those sorts of words may be associated with riots and change and stuff like that. So you've got this chance to contrast the Viking raids, the invasions, and so on. Because what we've got to remember is that the Vikings, some were actually invited to come to Britain as well, to the British Isles as well, but some were invaders as well. But again, that language of invitation and invaders were were forced upon African Caribbean people coming to the British Isles in the 20th century as well. So again, history allows us to examine these terms more carefully, using the past and the recent to understand what the future may hold and how we can adapt to future changes on the British Isles. So here are some of the responses from the teachers. You can make kind of relations in that way. Next slide. And another comment, a few comments from the teachers here. Yeah, that's Britishness, about being able to express yourself as part of these cross-cultural encounters. Equality. I guess one of the most significant responses I got from the teachers as part of their examining of the oral testimonies, which centered the British voice, was talking about if teachers need to be talking about tolerance and equality as part of teaching and learning about fundamental British values, then we're going to have to need more multicultural perspectives within the curriculum. I think this notion of fundamental British values, which is in the system, can use cross-cultural encounters, not just from the past, not just from Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, but more recently to further more knowledge and understanding around those terms of mutual respect and tolerance. Even through the stories of, the story of Stephen Lawrence and his murder, even through these cross-cultural encounters of the Brixton uprisings of the 1980s, they relate to those fundamental British values of tolerance and respect and so on. So it's about not just using the history that's imposed upon us, but the histories that don't get that attention that could be just as valuable, if not even more valuable. So primary school teachers, next slide, and trainees must be empowered to engage in questions and debate of the what and the why of curriculum interpretation in their teaching and learning, not simply become curriculum makers, but to become critical curriculum thinkers and actively evaluating the educational worth of the statutory content directives and guidance of the National History Curriculum. So my research does not dismiss teaching and learning about Britain's settlement by Anglo-Saxons and Scots and the Vikings and Anglo-Saxon struggle. I seek to promote critical examination of these curriculum directives in juxtaposition with the cross-cultural encounters from the 20th century between African Caribbean people and white British people. Next slide. So we've got opportunities to transform curriculum teaching and learning, first by decolonising and then by diversifying through different stories and experiences of people who've come to the British Isles, because people of the British Isles are the history makers. My research generated oral testimonies rewritten as narrative biographies from African Caribbean people and Black British people, and these narratives provided opportunity for primary school teacher trainees to explore how the past is related to the present, giving sense and meaning to our current social multicultural conditions as British people and future possibilities in its transformations. My work fits with the national curriculum aim to understand historical concepts such as continuity and change, cause and consequence, similarity, difference, and significance, and use them to make connections, draw contrasts, analyze trends, frame historically valid questions, and create your own structured accounts, including written narratives and analysis. So final thoughts, next slide. The central message from my research is that the current primary school history curriculum, teaching and learning directives, guidance comes through a dominant white British ethnic nationalist narrative, and that reinforces inequality and division of British people. If we continue with that curriculum, it's going to manifest a continued division of British people because it doesn't represent all of British people. An improved primary school national history curriculum would give equal focus to the broader stories of peoples who, by various passages, have come to the British Isles over the ages. Any future revisions to the history curriculum of teaching and learning directives should incorporate the statutory teaching and learning of Black British people for use as a model in presenting the eclectic, fluid nature of our national identity and reforging the idea of nation in the 21st century. Thank you very much. There are some references. Next slide. And here is a response I'd like to get for you from my presentation. Just think about the presentation that I've given you and this question. Do you think your place of work has advanced further in its work with decolonising the curriculum since this time last year? So whether you work in ITE, whether you're a primary school teacher here or secondary school teacher or further education, in relation to history, in relation to English, in relation to your field of expertise. How well do you think your work has advanced decolonising the curriculum since this time last year? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marlon. Switch my camera. Right, I need the events to put my camera back on. While that's been done, I'm going to carry on. Thank you, Marlon, for a very insightful presentation. I am now delighted to welcome Khadija Mohammed. Khadija is a key sector leader who has taken the anti-racist work forward in Scotland, and she is involved very in the middle of the critical conversations in Scotland using an evidence-based approach. We have just emerged before today's event from a workshop with our senior strategic university and college leaders who will be piloting and testing assets that we've been part of creating before they are rolled out closer to the United Nations Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Today, Khadija shares her journey and how at critical moments along the journey have led her to take on the roles that she has and the importance of being at decision-making platforms to highlight gaps, share solutions, and take the sector along this journey towards anti-racism. Thank you, Khadija.
Thank you so much, Nighat. And I'm just wanting to check in with time. Am I okay for maybe 15, 20 minutes if we're allowing for Q&A? Yeah. Okay, so I'll just make a start then. So yeah, folks, my name's Khadija and I am a lecturer within UWS. I work across programmes, but I'm programme leader of the early years provision within UWS, so looking at working with our early years childhood practitioners. But part of that work is also working with student teachers. Like Marlon, I'm a primary school teacher by trade, and I've moved into working within the HE academia sector. Could I have the next slide, please, just with my journey as a BAME educator? So started off as a four-year BEd programme for teacher training many years ago, without giving my age away, and I found myself to be the only BAME student within my cohort that year. And I did what I did normally from my own schooling experience in Scotland, was just to try and fit in. I was assimilating into the white majority culture within my institution, within my peer cohort. And I didn't really question some of the knowledge that was being shared with us throughout that journey. And at times I wished that we'd had further conversations, more deeper conversations around my identity as a student teacher, because we heard so much about professional identity, but your personal was intimately linked with that. So it would have been really interesting for me to explore that a bit further. I went on to teach in an all-white school, and by that I mean the teachers were all white and the young people were all from a white ethnic background, so monocultural, monolinguistic. And then suddenly in that process, I met a lovely practitioner who was from an EAL service, English as an Additional Language service. She spotted me in the corridor in the school and said to me, we need folk like you in the base. And I remember remarking, and I was struck by the comment and said, what do you mean folk like me at the base? And she says, yeah, do you speak another language, Khadija? I said, well, yes, I do. I speak Punjabi and I speak Urdu at home. Yeah, absolutely. We need folk like you in the base. I said, well, actually, I'd rather stay in the mainstream classroom. And I was perplexed by that at that time. And it was only later did I begin to reflect on that aspect of my linguistic identity and how that could place me at perhaps an advantage when I'm trying to connect with the young people that I am working with. And that's irrespective of whether they are multilingual or bilingual or not. There was two critical incidents that happened within my teaching experience that really made me consider my own identity as a teacher. and think about the added value perhaps that I'm arguing that as a BAME educator we bring to the discussions. And it was around, one was around 9/11 when that incident happened. I came back to school to a group of 11, 12-year-olds who started asking questions around Islam, around Muslims. And at that point, folks, I wasn't visibly, I guess, identifiable as a Muslim. I didn't wear my hijab at the time. And I stopped the young people and said, does my name give you a clue as to what faith I follow? And it was this amazing discussion that unfolded afterwards around, you know, Muslim stereotyping and so on, but that I was all right. I was not like them. So that was really interesting. And through further discussions, we managed to really get the children to a place where they were beginning to realise that those stereotypes are very problematic and complex. And it led me into my work into academia as initially as a teacher educator, and then moved to another institution which I'm at currently, where I'm working more closely with early years practitioners. So what I found from that journey was another aspect of who I am as an educator and my role within navigating critical conversations around social justice, around perhaps developing an anti-racist consciousness to the work that I do. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, so again, I've mentioned already that sort of teacher education, early years folks, but what really my experiences have brought me to is thinking about my PhD work. I went about trying to interview minority ethnic teachers within Scotland, and as Marlon, you already indicated, the percentage is quite low in terms of in England, majority, I think 80% or so you said were from white ethnic backgrounds, whereas in Scotland, the primary teachers from a BME background are around 1.4% of our workforce, and beyond that, 0.6% in senior leadership positions. I think we only have one head teacher from a Black and minority ethnic background in Scotland, and that really needs to change. And so part of my research was around looking at those identities and wondering whether you know, how do they feel but when they're in a classroom and they're teaching? What perspectives do they bring or not bring? And do they feel that they have that sense of agency when they want to discuss their lived experiences? Could I have the next slide, please? So you'll see from the next slide that I've referred to as the 4A's model. This was essentially the kinds of comments that came out from my thesis and the themes that seem to emerge around professional identity. And it was so interesting talking to the group of Black and minority ethnic teachers, because for them, acknowledgement of the issue that racism exists, racial harassment is something that I experience on a day-to-day basis in my school, was for some really difficult to acknowledge, and for others were very confidently talking about it. And so that was really interesting. And what I found was the focus groups seemed to help, because there were those who were reluctant. They had perhaps, you know, the power of conformity, colleagues, is huge, and they had just learned very quickly to fit in. And part of that's probably linked to their own experiences of their schooling in Scotland, where they just learned to fit in every time a racist incident had taken place, or they were exposed to that, and their teacher did not address it. It went unchecked. They internalized that. That internalization leads to that normalization of that behavior. It's something I'm just going to have to learn to put up with. And so therefore, when they embark on their own teaching experiences, it's something that doesn't enter into their thinking, I guess. But what happened was bringing the groups of teachers together and talking to each other in those focus groups really led to this affirmation, this recognition that for many of them, that they brought with them this added value, this cultural, linguistic, religious values to their teaching. And some spoke very confidently about how they used that to really have those critical, candid conversations with their young people. So questioning the knowledge, the curriculum that was being presented to them, whose voices were being marginalised, minoritized, what stereotypes were continually being reinforced. But there were those who didn't feel comfortable doing that at all, and were perhaps more fearful of the implications that may have on their career trajectory, or having to answer to perhaps a senior member of staff Why are you having those discussions in your classroom, or fear of what pupils may say? So that was really interesting for me to unpack. And obviously that was questions around agency. And we know that when we look at literature across teacher agency, oftentimes we talk about that restricted in terms of policy and how policy can dictate on how we as teachers do what we do. But for BAME teachers, there was this added layer in terms of restriction to that agency, because they were then questioned by their colleagues. You know, why do you always raise those issues? And why do you need to speak to the young people about decolonisation and so on and so forth? So it was really interesting to see how some BAME teachers were really bringing that hidden curriculum and offering that visibility to those critical questions. And those who were just going in and saying, in fact, one particular teacher said, when I'm in school, I teach maths. That's all I do. I go in there and I teach maths, and that's it. I don't allow my personal identity to come into the classroom. And in actual fact, one of the teachers said, well, you can't change the colour of your skin. So how do you manage that? And it was some really thought-provoking and insightful conversations that took place. But folks, for many of them, it led to this notion of activism and that building that capacity and resilience to make a difference and question and disrupt the status quo, and begin to think about how they could actively within their schools take forward some of this work. Now, I think we need to note here is being a BAME educator doesn't necessarily make you an anti-racist educator. So I think that became really evident within our discussions, that many of them had to perhaps go away and develop their own nuanced understanding of race and racism, because again, like Marlon has indicated, British history, Scottish history that is taught within our schools perhaps don't, it's those hidden histories, Nigel, that you refer to at the very beginning, that in order to find out about yourself and bring your whole self into a situation, you need to know those missing pieces of the jigsaw. Can I have the next slide, please? And I guess that just led me to talk to various key stakeholders, because what I found was, when talking to teachers, when talking to senior leaders within schools, that conversations around racism and whiteness were just not happening in Scotland, particularly in our education sector, where if we talked about white privilege or whiteness, there was a level of defensiveness, perhaps a level of complacency and a nervousness that seemed to come to the surface, and that we really need to have a space, a safe space, where we can have those real critical conversations around how racism and whiteness manifest within our institutions and schools, our policies and our practices, so questioning that curriculum. And another note that I made was, many times our colleagues remain silent on this front, so that conspiracy of silence, that becoming complicit when you don't raise the questions, or when you watch a colleague being experienced microaggressions on a day-to-day basis within their workplace. So it was really interesting to begin to have those conversations with Scottish Government, with Education Scotland, and so on. And I'll talk a wee bit about that later. Could I have the next slide, please, around activism and agency? So absolutely, that really led me actually to begin to think about what needs to be done. How do I begin to offer visibility to my BAME colleagues in Scotland? How do we centre their voices? For years they've been marginalised, and how do we begin to get them to move away from a deficit-based approach? Because oftentimes they're asked questions, are you sure you want to work here? There's not many of you kind here. Or actually, you know, your accent's quite strong. Do the young people even understand you? And so therefore, very many of them working from that deficit-based approach, that they're just not good enough as a teacher, to looking at asset-based approaches. And Nigel and I have been working closely on this work as well. So I co-founded SAMI with a group of colleagues, and I now chair this particular association. And what we've developed is a leadership and mentoring programme where we really absolutely centre the voices of our BAME colleagues. We do have, it's centred around the 4 A's, so the acknowledgement. Let's deal with the fact that racism exists. We see how it exists and how it manifests within our workplaces. But let's park that now and let's move on from that and think about ourselves. So that notion of self-care, thinking about that emotional labour that goes into it, unpacking some of that racial trauma, to then really building on peer-to-peer support, career counselling. And also actually what it's doing is it's working really well because we're trying to get that visibility, as I said earlier. And so some of our participants in these programmes are now working with our local authorities within schools in Scotland, where they are involved in reverse mentoring. So some of our participants are now working with head teachers in schools that are not their own school, and leading anti-racist work within that. Or others perhaps don't want to go down the journey of race equality, but actually bring the cultural wealth there. So a teacher who's involved in nurture and attachment, but because it's a very diverse school, young people have very different experiences of nurture and attachment depending on your cultural background, religious background. And so she's able to bring that lens to those discussions and really centering those lived experiences into the discussion. And another project that we're running currently is the Hamari Behjan project, our identity. What is our identity, and working with our young people? Because what we're finding, folks, is recruitment into teaching as a profession is particularly problematic for us here in Scotland. And again, my argument has always been we might push for recruitment, but we also need to sort the issues that our current existing BME workforce experience. Young people, when you ask them, would you like to think of as a career, will actually turn around and say, no, you're kidding me, I don't want to do that. I see the way my Black teacher's being treated. And so therefore, they don't see that as an attractive career to embark upon. And so this career counselling, peer-to-peer support, really having visible our minority ethnic teachers in school settings as leaders within those school settings is so important for us to move forward. And that work is being led by Professor Rowena Arshad, a really fantastic colleague of mine who is chairing our short-term working group on diversifying the teaching workforce. And we identified, I think, around about 17 recommendations. So really now starting to seek responsibility and accountability from our key stakeholders that are involved in our initial teacher education programmes, looking into our leadership programmes. Why is it that our leadership programmes are not attracting BAME teachers? What about coaching and mentoring of our BAME teachers? Where are those conversations? Because oftentimes, even in research, our BME teachers are missing from that conversation. Could we have the next slide, please? And so my argument really here is finally a seat at the table. We, many of our BAME teachers who join SAMI as an organisation and undertake the leadership mentoring programme have that seat at that table, have that voice. But sometimes, folks, it's not just having that voice, it's about, is that voice being valued? Are we acting on the advice of our BAME colleagues? And that's really important. So any race equality issues or plans that we may have need to be initiated by our BAME colleagues, centering those voices, letting them bring those lived experiences and those challenges to those discussions, but they also then need to be actioned by their white colleagues, their effective white allies that will help them to work with them to take those conversations forward. So this is just an idea of the key stakeholders that we've worked with over the last a few years in terms of SAMI, and it's been great to have that partnership, and also the seat at the table with the General Teaching Council as vice convener. Oftentimes we have papers discussing teachers' professional development, teachers' professional regulation, and so on and so forth. And in those conversations, I'm encouraging my colleagues to say, keep asking yourself, are we missing a group of teachers here? Because the visibility of our Black and minority ethnic teachers, as I said, often we miss them, and we need to have those voices centred at those discussions. And just maybe moving on to the last few slides, folks. So this is, if we have the next slide, thank you, George. This is more around the work that I'm currently doing with NIGID. NIGID is leading the project on behalf of Advance HE, and I've had the privilege to chair this particular cohort. And it's been brilliant, folks. Now, it's back to my model again, acknowledgement. We needed, when we first met as a steering group, there was 15 members of the steering group, And I think 14 out of the 15 were from a BAME background, and it was superb. We all brought our lived experiences, our expertise. But when we first met face to face, I think this time, it was January last year, we looked around the room and we thought, seriously, are we back here again? And are we still having those conversations? Because this was the European Human Rights Commission in October 2019 that reported that racial harassment was commonplace within our university and college campuses. And what we decided from the very beginning was we need to stop calling this diversity or inclusion. We need to actually just say racism exists on our campuses and our society, and we need to call it what it is. And oftentimes I find when we use terms like diversity, it's safe, and it just doesn't. I think it loses that critical edge. And the work of Sarah Ahmed has really informed my thinking in that regard as well. So we need to be mindful. And oftentimes with social justice, the literature I read around socially just leaders seems to focus on additional support needs, gender, and other protected characteristics. Race always seems to fall off the agenda. And so together we need to stand united against this. So if you can have the next slide, please. And we felt that once the sector, we had all 26 colleges and all of our 19 universities in Scotland endorsed this declaration. And it was really overwhelming to get our senior leader buy-in, because we did not want this to be another campaign that then just falls off that radar. Senior sector buy-in, but in order for them to take this pledge, we needed to provide them with a scaffold. So the statement of intent is exactly what it's there for, to provide our institutions with that support in actually bringing that action, that tangible change that we're looking for. And as you can see there, there's 8 elements to that, and I'll not talk through all of them because I don't think we'll have time, but the first 2 were particularly important for us, and in my job as an academic, was this fostering an anti-racist culture of understanding folks. If our senior leaders are not racially literate, and then we're not able to have that anti-racist consciousness, that lens applied to looking at why our current policies and practices are not fit for purpose in terms of BAME staff, BAME students, and so on. The Developing an Anti-Racist Curriculum is the sub-project that Nigid referred to earlier in my introduction, that we're now setting about creating a starter guide, and that's to do some desk-based research, to look at all the good work that's already out there around decolonising the curriculum, and then bringing it to a Scottish perspective for us within Scotland. And we asked questions around, Khadija, why didn't you call it developing, or thinking about a decolonised curriculum, Marlon? And I was very clear about that, in the sense that I felt that when you're having conversations around decoloniality and so on, actually what we're having is we're developing that really important anti-racist consciousness as well as those discussions. So for me, it comes hand in hand, and that's been really key. And then to begin to think about that investment in a diverse workforce, we need to have BAME senior leaders within our colleges, within our universities, within our schools. We need to let our young people see them in those senior leader positions, but more importantly, that diversity of thought, that lived experience that they bring with them will absolutely move the conversations forward. But we need to be also mindful that that burden of representation does not fall on our BAME colleagues. So allyship is really key in moving forward. And the biggest thing for us was responsibility and accountability. So we really need to make sure that we repeatedly have those conversations, and we check in on a quarterly basis or sooner. How are we getting on within our institutions? What conversations are not happening? What do we need to progress further? I think I'm going to stop there, Nigid, because I'm conscious of time, and hope that we've got some questions that we can move towards. I also did have, I think, a question on the poll as well about how confident do you feel about navigating conversations around race, because what we're finding in certainly here is that people some are confident to say, I don't know, Khadija, I don't know where to start, and that's a great starting point from my perspective, but it's when we deny that these things are happening that's problematic.
Thank you, Khadija. Waiting now for Perry to share some of the questions with us from our viewers. Right. I think one question that's, oh, Perry's back, so good. I will start with the first question while Perry sorts out her audio. The first question is, if we want education to be more effective in addressing racism, does it not need to be central to curricula, not peripheral to the economic growth skills agenda?
Yeah, I think we all agree that curriculum, as you know, there's that document, there's that policy, and it's about how it's what the teacher brings to that, and it's what the students bring to it as well. We bring our own influences to it as well, and but not being led by that particular document, and being absolutely accountable to it. Of course, there are statutory requirements in these documents that we're asked to teach and learn through, but it's about being able to almost subvert them so that there's a sense of commonality in those statutory elements. So it does really lay in the hands of the educator to be empowered to work with curriculum so that it can include everybody. So it can be done, but we just need to be able to share how that can be done with future teachers and current teachers as well.
Khadija, do you want to add to that, please?
I'll just unmute myself, that would be helpful. Yeah, I would agree with Marlon, and I do absolutely think that it has to be central. It's a central part of our curriculum, and not. I always believe sometimes that we do some tokenistic measures as well, Perry, in terms of, we sometimes have culture weeks or, multicultural week and so on within our schools. And we need to avoid those kinds of celebrations because oftentimes they reinforce negative stereotypes. There needs to be a criticality to those discussions in planning stages. Are we actually, in delivering this, going to reinforce negative stereotype? Just for example, I visited a school recently, just before lockdown, and they were doing African Culture Week. And the young people were involved in making masks and listening to African music and tasting some food. And as much as it seemed quite exciting, I actually made the comment and said, have you been to Africa recently or any place near Africa, and do folk walk around wearing masks? And my colleague said, Khadija, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And I said, no, I know, but we need to make sure that we're absolutely getting the message across correctly to the young people, so it's factual. Otherwise, it just resorts to tokenistic behaviours. I see that when it comes to things like Ramadan and Eid, and it's, asking the Muslim teacher to come in and speak and say a few words, but actually to say to your white colleagues, oh, well, why don't you sit in with me when I speak to my class about it? And so therefore you can learn about that. And then the next time you lead on those conversations. And so that burden of representation doesn't always fall to BAME colleagues.
Thank you for that, Khadija. And Diane asks, Mark says, if we want education to be more effective in addressing racism, does it not need to be central to curricula, not peripheral to the economic growth skills agenda? I think that's the question you just answered. Yeah, sorry. It's from Diane. Says, it is always interesting to us BAME educators how little many white students, tutors, people know of anything about our background, culture. Hence Marlon's point that the history curriculum is not diverse. Who knows about why Britain is a multicultural set of nations? Hardly anyone. So I think that is a response to Marlon's kind of presentation, as opposed to a question per se. But do you have anything to say to that, Marlon?
Sorry. I think I guess the points that I was trying to make as well, and I think this relates to what Khadija is saying as well, is that we have to have these discussions. Decolonizing, that term decolonizing does allow people to engage in discussions around anti-racism, and then from that, diversification, equality of experiences can be shared. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with my work. Really, I'm trying to show that the past is very much in the present, and in the stories of the past there was multiculturalism, just as there are in the stories of the present. And it's about being able to understand those stories from different voices. And sometimes, the non-white voice needs to lead that. So that's the message that I was trying to come across in my presentation today. So I think Get's going to say some things now. Actually, so.
Thank you. One quick one. One last question. I think we are running almost time. How can we change recruitment practices to attract a more diverse field of candidates in Scotland? I think that's more for maybe Khadija.
Yeah, sorry, Perry, could you repeat that question?
How can we change recruitment practices to attract a more diverse field of candidates in Scotland?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that we've been discussing at length, haven't we, Nigud? And we've been advising, colleges, universities about their recruitment processes, and for schools as well. So first and foremost, the job spec, the person spec that we put out, we tend to use a very traditional approach to those specifications. And actually, let's be a bit more specific sometimes and say that we're looking for, and be very open about looking for, welcoming diverse candidates. But also for us, it was about the recruitment panel, that when you don't see people...
Khadija, we've run out of time.
Oh, sorry.
No, but it's, again, the questions could come in and we'll answer them. I would just like to say thank you so much to Bira Events for organising the event today. As speakers, Marlon and Khadija, my co-conveners, Marlon and Perry, and we look forward to welcoming you back to our next webinar. Thank you to you. Thank you to our audience for joining us today and for sharing such rich questions with us. We hope to continue the conversation.